Hello, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to this evening's project showcase with IFA. As many of you know, India Foundation for the Arts is an independent national not-for-profit that supports and implements grants and projects in the area of research, practice, and education. Part of what we also do is share the outcomes of the projects that we've implemented. These could be films, exhibitions, conversations. And we started the Project Showcase series of events online during the pandemic and have continued to share this event with you each month as a way to encourage conversations about our projects, about concerns in the arts and culture, and bring these projects to you. Today, we have a very special showcase, which is from our Archives and Museums program. And this project today that we're going to be sharing with you is a project that we implemented with the Museum of Christian Art. We are very grateful to the Goethe Institute Delhi and Parijat Foundation for supporting our Archives and Museum program and this particular project as well. Before I invite my colleague Sumana to tell you more about the program, this particular project, and our panelists today, just a couple of house rules. Here on Zoom, you can use the comment section to share your thoughts, chat with each other, and leave comments for the panelists. But if you'd like to ask questions to the panelists, I would request you to please use the Q&A box. For those of you watching on Facebook, my colleague will be checking Facebook as well, so you can send in your questions in the comments section on Facebook, and we'll take them here on Zoom. So after the presentation, there will be a chance for Q&A where we can address your questions and have the panelists respond to them. I'd like to now invite Sumana, program lead at India Foundation for the Arts, to tell you a little bit more about the Archives and Museums program.
Thank you, Menaka, and a very good evening to all of you. We're very happy that you all have joined us here on Zoom and on Facebook. To tell you very briefly, among the various programs that are at IFA, we have the Archives and the Museums program, which is a relatively new program, but a very exciting program. This is an opportunity for us to partner with various archives and museums across the country, and through this partnership enable projects within those institutions that enable scholars and practitioners to creatively work with the artifacts, the materials that exist in these spaces. So one such project that we enabled goes back to 2021-22. This was right in the middle of the pandemic year, when we collaborated with the Museum of Christian Art in Goa to enable a project that narrates the history of Goa using select objects from the museum's collection of Indian Christian art. The project has resulted in a very exciting podcast, which has 16 episodes currently in English and in Konkani, and there are 9 more episodes that are going to be added. We are delighted today to be joined here on this conversation by Anirudh Kanisetti and Kevin Fernandes, the two people who worked on this very exciting project at the Museum of Christian Art. Anirudh is a historian by training, and he is also the author of the book Lords of the Deccan, Southern India from the Chalukyas to the Cholas. He also hosts a very popular podcast called Echoes of India. His collaborator, Kevin Fernandes, is a researcher and is currently the assistant professor of English at the Indian Institute of Psychology and Research at Bangalore. Both Anirudh and Kevin worked on this very exciting project, but not without the support of somebody very special from MoCA. That is Natasha Fernandes, who is also with us in this discussion this evening. Natasha is the curator of MoCA in Goa, and she has curated several museum projects. She has curated experiences and heritage walks in Old Goa. Natasha has been creative and the institutional backbone for this project in some ways, and the three of them together are going to be in conversation today, talking to us about the whole exciting journey, the process, what happened out of it, and what are the future exciting directions that have now emerged from this lovely project. I'd now request Minaka and Natasha to lead the conversation.
Yeah. Thank you, Sumana. Natasha, lovely to have you here. One of the things that IFA is most under our Archives and Museums program is to partner with institutions that have very unique collections. And it goes without saying that the Museum of Christian Art has a very unique collection of Indian Christian art that's housed there. And the other thing that interests us is how can we support and implement initiatives that showcase narratives that don't normally get spoken about. And once again, MoCA kind of offers that opportunity for artists and curators to engage with your space and look at histories that perhaps don't get spoken about as often. Natasha, this is really a long journey we've had. We actually share a common history in that we are both IFA and MoCA are 29 years in their 29th year, moving towards our 30th year. And we met Natasha pre-pandemic. We visited the MoCA, the museum, and in pre-pandemic, looking to partner with them. And at that point, they were going through this wonderful initiative of renovation and restoration, and it just felt like the right, and it took some time for them to come to that space where we could partner with them on this initiative. And interestingly, we actually implemented this project that you're going to be hearing about during the pandemic. So it's quite a special project in that the partnership unfolded during the pandemic. So Natasha, one of the reasons, of course, like I said, there were all these factors to do with the Museum of Christian Art. And when Anirudh and Kevin applied under this particular call, what interested us was the manner in which they would be engaging with the objects and the manner in which they would be sharing the stories of MoCA and Indian Christian art. So we'd love to hear from you about your experience and what excited you about this partnership, and also the specific project that Anirudh and Kevin came to us with.
Thank you, Maneka, for having MoCA on this very special session today on the Project Showcase, along with Anirudh and Kevin sharing about the podcast. So yes, as you pointed out, MoCA and IFA have had an interesting journey from the beginning. And as a member of MoCA, I've been always following IFA's interesting projects that y'all have been doing over the years and hoping to collaborate at some point. And having met some of you pre-pandemic and having, starting to have dialogues and discussions on possibilities of collaborations. Of course, it did materialize only in the pandemic. I think we had more time, and we thought of doing things during the pandemic to really reach a wider audience who would not be physically able to visit the museum. And when Kevin and Anirudh shared their proposal, it was really something that appealed to us, because sitting in our homes, we are able to listen to a podcast anywhere in the world, and MoCA could have that accessibility through a podcast. That is what excited us the most. And of course, we're so happy that we were able to implement this project in collaboration with IFA, and had the opportunity to work both with Anirudh and Kevin so closely during that time. And we continue to associate and have lovely discussions around the museum, around the objects, along with IFA.
Thanks. Thank you, Natasha. I'm hoping that some of the audience members have had a chance to listen to the podcast and get a glimpse of what is there at the Museum of Christian Art. And I'm sure you're also curious about the process that Anirudh and Kevin, and how they approached these objects. So I'd like to invite Anirudh and Kevin actually to share their presentation and share their process with us.
Thank you so much, Meneka. Maybe we can start with this short clip of the episode.
What do you think about when I say Goa? Sun and sand, perhaps. Beachside shacks and fresh seafood. Maybe also imagine the large Baroque structures of the Basilica of Bom Jesus and Say Cathedral, splendid in raw red laterite and white lime-wash splendor in the hot sun. But if you were to push through the hordes of tourists in holiday clothes, sunglasses and hats, past the hawkers selling knickknacks and ice cream in electric colors, past tired vans and buses covered in fine red dust, you might reach the gentle slopes of what is now called Holy Hill. There you might see the lonely ruin of a tower which once overlooked a monastery of the order of St. Augustine, soaring into the sky as though suspended in time. Across the road from it are three imposing flying buttresses, lending a fortress-like quality to the building they support. This is the Convent of Santa Monica or Santa Monica, the mother of St. Augustine, whose crumbling tower, which we just saw, casts a gentle shadow over her building. This ancient structure, still busy with footsteps today, was built nearly 400 years ago, at a time when Goa was growing to become one of Asia's largest cities, larger even than distant Lisbon that ruled it from across the seas. It was commissioned at the request of the thriving populace of Goa to provide a space for local women who felt called to a religious life. It also housed women of Portuguese extraction who were unmarried, widowed, or had husbands considered missing. The complex of Santa Monica, as indomitable as a fortress, was built to keep the constant chaos and change of the world at bay, to provide a secluded, stable world for contemplation and prayer. But time had other plans. Welcome to the Altar of Time, a history of India's Christian art.
I have to say, I hope I didn't embarrass myself too much with my voiceover being the first things that you guys heard. But with that said, we really hope that you check out the podcast and that you enjoy our discussion over the next 20 minutes or so as we take you through how we actually made this little project.
All right, so we'll probably begin with a little story, a little backstory as to how this project was born. So this is Anirudh and me about maybe 5 years or 10 kgs ago at this beautiful little town called Penukonda. Penukonda sits about 555 kilometers away from Goa, and I mean it's not a name that is familiar to most people. Penukonda was the second capital of the Vijayanagara Empire following the fall of Hampi and the Battle of Talikota. And Anirudh, with his enthusiasm for medieval Deccan history, led us to this in search of this place. And we literally went in search of this place. And all we found was, a little plateau full of ruins and a few structures here and there among them. And we were absolutely alone there. There was no one at that monument at all, or at that space. And as we sat there watching the step well and all of these invasive plants growing all over the temple ruins, we began to discuss what it would have been like at its peak, because this was the capital, right? There would have been a court, there would have been soldiers and a bazaar and temple dancers, musicians, the works. But today, all that was there was this bunch of stones piled one on top of the other. And we finished our trip. We returned back to Bangalore, and life went on in its own ways. But I think somewhere at that peak in Penukonda, there was a seed for an idea. which was to humanize history and tell stories from history through the voices of people who were a part of it.
So this brings us to the question of why a podcast. And we hope that the first couple of minutes that you heard, which were from episode 2 of The Altar of Time, give you a sense of the potential of the podcast as a form that can really bring a particular place to life in a way that the written word cannot. I find that it's a very interesting challenge, because in a podcast, you can't show the viewer exactly what you're talking about, which is, it's counterintuitive that one would choose to make a podcast about objects, because one would expect that you would want to see the objects. But the interesting thing about podcasts is that you can use audio and you can use the imagination of your listeners to try and recreate the time and the place where these objects were created. So it was especially interesting to us, for example, when making episode 2, to create the impression of what a convent might have sounded like. So, the ringing of the bells and the rustle of the habits of the nuns, for example. It's a world that I think many Indians, myself included, were not familiar with. Those of us who are not Catholics, those of us who are not Christians, find this a world that very few of us really talked about, that very few of us generally experience. And we thought that being able to bring this to life, to actually help people transport themselves into that world using their imaginations, would be a very interesting challenge. And we just learned so much through the project of actually doing this. The image that you see here, for example, seems fairly innocuous. It's got pineapples on this beautiful little piece of clothing that would have been worn by altar boys. And to us, a pineapple is something that's, it's a pineapple. How special can it be? But as somebody who, as Kevin mentioned, is quite interested in the medieval Deccan, I recognize the pineapple as a motif that you also see on the tombs of the Qutub Shahi Sultans of Golconda. And it is so interesting to me to see this beautiful Indo-Portuguese object of art, or at least we think of it as an object of art right now. I think Kevin will have more to say on that later. To see this, a contemporary of the Qutub Shahis of Golconda, a part of the same subcontinent that the Qutub Shahis were inhabiting, to see it emblazoned with the same motif that you see on the tombs of Deccan sultans. And we'll have much more to say on this, but I think hopefully I've given you a sense of the potential, A, of the podcast format for telling these kinds of stories, and B, the stories that even those of us who actually research and know about this period generally don't know. So just generally speaking, there was so much both for us to learn and for us to bring to new audiences through this podcast.
Yeah, so this is the project site, the Museum of Christian Art. It's located, like you heard in the introduction, there is the Tower of St. Augustine, and opposite it, on the other side of the road, is the Convent of Santa Monica. Convents at that particular point in time didn't look anything like they do today. There was the practice of enclosure, where nuns would not interact with the public, and when they would access the church or the chapel, it would be through a grilled structure or a grilled space. That area is called the cloister, and that's where the museum is housed today. On the other side of the cloister is the chapel, which is open to the public, and today that is a space for performances, presentations, concerts, etc. Right? Now, what's very, very fascinating with this particular space was that it was built in 1606. And when I say 1606, I mean, the date probably has zero significance or zero relevance, unless you're a literature student and then you think of the King James translation in 1606. But when I say 1606, it's very, very fascinating, because this structure was an active, alive structure where people lived, worked, etc. for the last 400 years. And it predates the Taj Mahal by about 20 years. Now, suddenly, when I say it predates the Taj Mahal by 20 years, all of this looks very, very different, right? Because to imagine that this is not a monument, unlike the Taj Mahal, which is probably locked and not really accessible to the public, the Convent of Santa Monica was an active building where people moved around every day, right? And it still stands today. It's changed many forms and many meanings over the course of its existence. And you can hear about some of the different things it was used for in the second episode of the podcast. But essentially, one of the reasons why we're highlighting this particular idea is to kind of suggest how very important it is for us when we talk about history or when we talk about narrativizing history to kind of talk about history in relation to other histories. Because we forget that the world was constantly in dialogue, right? And if you'd indulge me for a second, the pineapple is one of those examples, right? The Bible never mentions the pineapple because the world had never seen pineapples before the 16th century. The first pineapples came to Europe in the 16th century from the New World, from Latin America. And when they came, they were luxury items, right? Which is why even when the Portuguese brought them to India, the Deccan sultans would buy these pineapples and display them as luxury wares at their banquets and things like that, just as it was done in Europe, right? It's so fascinating to see how the same object which you see here on the chasuble is also represented on the tombs. And the reason why it's represented is because it is a luxury object, right? It's the equivalent of a string of pearls or a diadem with diamonds, anything of that sort, right? So it's very, very important in the process of telling stories from history that we do not see history in isolation or in vacuum, but as a conversation between multiple strands that are operating in the world together. I do you want to?
So I mean, we'll of course get to this in a little more detail in the discussion, but it was extremely exciting when Kevin and I first actually started going through the catalog of the Museum of Christian Art, because we would constantly see these parallels, these dialogues with other cultures that one does not necessarily expect. For example, if you were to look at the image on your right, you'll see there's this cherubic kind of face with this interesting, almost serpentine body on what is very clearly a Christian ritual object. And this little image is actually of a naga. So, it's a serpentine creature that all of us, I'm sure, have read about in Amar Chitra Katha, but it seems like the last thing that we expect to see on a Christian object. And yet here it is indubitably showing us that the artisans who worked on these kinds of objects very much brought to the things that they were creating the very ancient vocabulary of symbols and signs that had perhaps been passed down to them from generations upon generations. And now in the new kind of Indo-Portuguese cultural context in which they found themselves, they continued to try and fit these symbols into a completely new cultural world. The image on your left, which is of the baby Jesus, has become especially fascinating to me because I've recently been reading about Mughal art. And this is very famous, actually, a number of very famous images of Mughal Emperor Jahangir, where he's actually standing on a globe. Which you can see that the baby Jesus here is also doing. And there is considerable evidence, of course, that the Portuguese sent missions to the Mughal court and that the Mughals had examples of European printed manuscripts with them. Which served as the inspiration for Jahangir's portraits. And you can see here, once again, this completely different object that's still participating in the same multi-centric, multicultural world where many, many systems are in dialogue with each other, producing objects like this. And of course, that's just one example. You can see a much more obvious one in this object itself, which is the beautiful little snake that is actually entwined around the globe. Once again, a very clear reminder of the South Asian heritage that the Indo-Portuguese artist was drawing upon.
So, talk a little bit about our process. Our process obviously began with a long list, and a lot. I mean, we both got copies of the catalog. We went through the catalog, and then we decided to just gamble and say, you know what, we'll meet on so and so date, and we will share the list. Each of us will share a long list, and we decided the long list, I think, would be 35 or 40 objects. And very interestingly, there were about 30 objects in that list which overlapped, right, between the two of us. The objects we identified were both of us picked the same objects to talk about, right, which we felt should be there in the short list. So therefore, the narrowing down was a lot easier. So normally our writing, I mean, we work on each episode in this manner. I begin writing. I write as an insider, as a practicing Christian. I structure each episode with references to the Bible, to Christian theology, to Christian art history wherever possible. And I talk about the liturgy and how these objects would possibly be used in churches and homes. And then, I send the script over to Anirudh. Anirudh goes through it and he makes the edits. And he also adds a little bit more on the history of South India and the larger Indian Ocean world, which he's an expert in. And once we're done, once we feel comfortable with the script, we send it over to Natasha and the team at MoCA. They have a look at it, and usually, most often than not, corrections come in two forms. Either they are factual errors, right? Sometimes there is information that we really don't have access to, and they're able to spot those gaps in our script, and they point them out. And at other times, there are ideological errors, right, that need to be corrected because sometimes we write about these things very dispassionately or very objectively, and we forget that these are objects used by real people, right? And believers will also be part of the audience. So, for instance, there's a tendency to write about these things as Christian myths or Christian legends or Christian narratives, right? But we have to keep in mind that for a section of our audience, these are scriptures, right? So we have to ensure that we treat this narrative or we treat this script with the kind of respect and reverence due so as to not rub people the wrong way. And then once we have these conversations about these changes, we send it over to our sound engineer. We're blessed with an excellent sound engineer, Ishan. Ishan has a look at the script. He gives us some tips and pointers as to how he thinks we should narrate the script. The script is then recorded. Anirudh is primarily the voice of the podcast, though there are some episodes voiced by me as well. And once the recording is done, Ishan does the editing. He sends it back to us. We have a look at it, make whatever changes are required, and then they go live on a weekly basis. Now, I just want to draw your attention to two or three things. I mean, the first thing is that, one, I come from an academic space and Anirudh comes primarily from a public history space, right? Writing history for public consumption through the form of newspaper articles, through the form of podcasts and things like that. And like any good academic, when I feel like I'm not able to make a substantial point, I just use long, unending sentences, right? Because if I can't make sense, I might as well at least confuse my reader. Now, this doesn't work in the podcast, right? Because a podcast is meant to listen, right? And it requires short sentences in the active voice, right? In opposition to academic writing, which is long sentences in the passive. So that was a very interesting experience for me, right? To completely change the way I look at writing and storytelling. The second was, sometimes I would send a script to Anirudh, and then, at like 2 in the morning, I get a message from him saying, bro, what is this transubstantiation, right? And then, I have to take a step back and be cognizant of the fact that most of our readers are not believers, right? They don't come from a Christian background, or the closest they've probably been to Christianity is probably Santa Claus, right? So that's when, I have, both of us actually have to take a step back and look at how we can tell or convey this idea or this particular fact of theology or Christian belief in a way which is accessible to people who may not necessarily belong to this socio-cultural milieu. And which is why this object is particularly spectacular, right? I mean, of course, as an art object in itself, it is magnificent. This is the pelican monstrance. And this is one of those objects where, we really had to bring in so many different things, right? Now, in Christian art history or Christian iconography, the pelican comes from one stray verse in the Psalm, which says, I am like unto the pelican. And there's no other mention of the pelican in the Bible at all. There's just one verse. And at some point in the early church history, they began to use the pelican as a symbol for Christ, because there was this belief that the pelican would rip open its breast in order to feed its young, right? Which you see kind of being represented here, the pelican pecking into itself and the young perched beneath. Now, obviously, this is a misconception. The pelican has a pouch beneath its beak where it stores food and then regurgitates it to feed its young. And that's how this image enters Christian iconography. Now, very fascinatingly, when we were working on this episode, it never occurred to me that this bird is not a pelican, right? Because the catalog said pelican monstrance. I just kept calling it the pelican monstrance. And then Anirudh pointed out to me how this looks more like an eagle or a peacock, right? And that's when the thought dawned on us that the artisans, the silversmiths who made this object would have probably never seen a pelican. And the closest birds in Hindu mythology are the Garuda and the peacock, right? So it's likely that we use this, and it is probably a peacock, looking at the shape of the beak and the plumage on the head, as well as the body. But the kind of feet and the kind of wings also suggest that it could be a bird of prey, right? They took these two ideas, the idea of a peacock and an eagle, and kind of fused it together to make what the Christian commissioners or the patrons of this particular object call the pelican monstrance, right? And this object is so important. It features in the history of the world in 100 objects. It was also used for the Eucharistic convention that took place in Bombay sometime in the 80s, right? So this object was transported from Goa to Bombay and then was a part of that international convention. So that's the kind of work that we have to do with each episode. We have to tie together scripture, theology, church history, European tradition and Indian tradition, right? And very sadly, a lot of this information is not accessible. We don't know who the makers of these objects are. So we just have to make very well-educated guesses based on, contemporary art that exists from this particular period. I also wanted to point out how, when I talk about the process, how we're very lucky to have 2 episodes in Konkani. We're grateful to IFA that as part of their vision, they want to make knowledge and knowledge production accessible to Indian communities, right? Not just knowledge production in silos of excellence. So they really nudged us in the direction of having episodes translated, and through Natasha and the team at MoCA, we were put in touch with Tina Costa, and Tina Costa translated 2 episodes of our podcast into Konkani. They're both available on Spotify right now, right? Some of the early work in the oral space in Konkani. These are just some pictures behind the scenes. On the left, you have Anirudh recording for the Chasuble episode, right, with the pineapples. And on the right, you have there's me together with Ishan looking very disapprovingly at me at the back in the background, probably exhausted with all of the takes and retakes of each episode. We are also very lucky to have a live soundscape. So when you listen to the episode, you heard like a little clip from O Sacred Head, So Wounded. And we came across this concert being performed by the Bangalore Men. We took permission from them and we went to St. Andrew's Church here in Bangalore and we recorded their performance. So what you hear in the recording is the playing of the pipe organ in St. Andrew's. Bangalore has only 2 working pipe organs, St. Mark's and St. Andrew's. And what you hear, so that's why when you listen, if you listen very closely to the podcast episodes, you hear the sound of people whispering, pages being rustled, footsteps. Those are all real in situ sounds, right? Sounds recorded in a church in anticipation for a worship service, right? So that was something that's very, very exciting, right? The fact that we were able to actually capture the soundscape of a church and have it as part of our title track or opening track for every episode.
So one thing that I think we both of us really enjoyed towards the later stages of the podcast production was actually figuring out a visual identity for the podcast. What kind of logo like accurately represents everything that we're trying to do here, because there's just so much going on there. We're simultaneously trying to bring the very concept of Indian Christianity with its beliefs, with its rituals to life. We're also simultaneously diving quite deep into its past, into its dialogues with the broader history of South Asia and the Indian Ocean at large. And we're having a quite a devil of a time trying to figure out what would manage to encapsulate all that. One of the early ideas that we played with was potentially having a Portuguese galleon with this banner that's fluttering in the wind, and perhaps have like a podcast mic on that banner. But a galleon doesn't automatically just say Indian Christianity. And so we actually realized that the best possible inspiration comes from India's Christian art itself. So we looked particularly at the work of the great Goan artist, Angelo da Fonseca. And you can see an example of one of his masterpieces, really, on the left. So it's a depiction of the Virgin Mary with the baby Jesus. And this is just so striking, especially to South Indians, I think, because it's very obviously a young South Indian woman and a young South Indian child. And their iconography is it's simultaneously both so Indian with this beautiful lotus that she's holding, but also so Christian, this look of serenity and this beautiful halo that shines from both of their heads. We were also quite profoundly inspired by one of the objects from the Museum of Christian Art itself. I was actually in Goa just before the pandemic, so long before we had even got this idea of potentially doing a podcast with IFA and the Museum of Christian Art. I happened to be there and I was so struck really by this particular object, which is called Nirmala Mata, which quite literally means Immaculate Mother. And it's this magnificent, very Raja Ravi Varma-esque depiction of a goddess, this like long, demure 20th century sari. And of course, the crown and everything else you'd associate with the Raja Ravi Varma painting of a Hindu goddess, except that her iconography is so Christian. She's got this beautiful crescent moon at her feet, and in her halo, you do have something that appears like a Kirti Mukha, which is what you would see over these beautiful arches that you have over Hindu deities, but is obviously not. And we decided to do something that takes both these ideas, the idea of a very Indian-looking Mother Mary and the blessed baby Jesus, and also kind of fuse them with the iconography of this beautiful Nirmala Mata. And we were lucky, of course, also to get a talented designer, my friend Keshav Rajendran, who worked with us as an art director to bring this to life. So from the very outset, we wanted to make sure that both the Virgin Mary and her child would look like Indians. So we wanted them to have beautiful Indian colored skin. We also wanted them to have an arch that looked like something that you would expect from an Indian goddess, but of course, molded to Christian sensibilities, like the arch behind Nirmala Mata here. And finally, of course, we wanted something that made her look modern, which is why she's got these beautiful, vibrant pink headphones, which I'm so glad that we struck upon this idea of including. And of course, we had a pretty interesting back and forth with MoCA about some potential changes to the logo, which hopefully we'll get to in the discussion. And as Kevin said a little earlier, our audience obviously has sensibilities, and something that hadn't initially occurred to us as we were designing the logo, but that did come up later on. And that's something that we will get to eventually.
Yeah, so part of the, apart from the podcast in itself, right, and which continues to be produced and released, some of the exciting things we have done as part of this project, both Natasha and myself participated in a conference conducted by IFA, where I spoke in a panel on making museum spaces more accessible, the ways in which museum spaces can be more accessible. And I spoke about it primarily through the oral form of the podcast. And Natasha spoke about the challenges that, museum curators face in today's day and age. I've also been giving presentations on this podcast talking about Indo-Portuguese and Indian Christian art. The first of these presentations was at the launch of the podcast in Jan this year at the Museum of Christian Art. I've also been taking it across the city of Bangalore to various colleges and talking to young adults about Indo-Portuguese art and the podcast form. Yeah, what you see here is the inauguration with the Cardinal Philip Neri. And there's also been some amount of buzz in the press. This is an article where we covered the podcast and the idea of Indian Christian art. Apart from this, Anirudh has also done a column on Indian Christian art. I forget which publication.
It was with the print, and we'll talk about its colorful reception, hopefully in the discussion section.
Yeah, Anirudh.
So just to give you a sense of the listenership of the podcast, we were actually we were expecting and hoping, of course, that most of our listeners would be Indians, which, as you can see from the little geographic location section, that's exactly what happened. But we were also pleased that quite a few of our listeners came from the United States. We're guessing that that's the Indian diaspora abroad. In terms of gender, it's our listeners who are mostly male, tended to be slightly older folks. So if the younger folks in the audience, please listen and share with your friends. Of course, a project like this, we were hoping and dreaming that it would go viral, but obviously it's a bit of a complex and a bit of a niche subject is what we understood both as we were writing and as the episodes began to come out. But the beauty of a podcast is that it's up there on the internet for free forever. And it's on every single podcast platform. I keep getting notifications from podcast platforms I've never heard of saying that, hey, we have now included your podcast in our listings as well. So as long as the internet exists, the Altar of Time will exist. And hopefully it will continue to educate those who listen to it about the beauty and complexity of India's Christian artistic heritage.
With that, we wrap up. Just place on record our gratitude to MoCA and IFA for giving us the space, for giving us this project, and all of the learning that we have both received individually, personally and professionally. A warm community of people that IFA and MoCA have provided us, right? Sometimes it doesn't feel like work, or rather most of the time it doesn't feel like work, right? It's like a bunch of people sitting and talking and laughing together. And of course, our eternal gratitude to the artisans, whom we will never know, right? These nameless, faceless artisans who made these objects, and in the words of the Bible, who made the word flesh and made it dwell amongst us. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you get an opportunity at some point to not just listen to the podcast, but also visit the Museum of Christian Art in Goa. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anirudh. Thank you, Kevin. I'd like to now invite Natasha, Kevin, and Anirudh to a discussion. There are also a couple of questions in the Q&A box, which we can take along through our discussion. So over to you, Natasha, if you would like to lead.
Thank you, Anirudh and Kevin, for taking all of us through this beautiful process of the making of the podcast. And of course, you must have had many, many challenges. I know of some of them, but the challenges, or maybe how did you come to select the objects for the podcast?
So I think, Kevin, thank you, Natasha. And thank you, of course, for all your help and inputs over the course of the entire project. So where to begin? Going to the Museum of Christian Art, even without the objective of having to make a podcast from it, was just such an exciting experience for me. I was there with 3 other friends who were like, yeah, bro, these are objects, how excited are you going to get? But I was just running around from place to place, bringing it was just so completely beyond my imagination that things like this could exist. I still remember, and I hope that we will release the episode on this sooner rather than later. There's this magnificent little ivory of the baby Jesus in this little ivory cradle, and he's wearing anklets. And I was so struck by it because at the same time that this object was being made, devotion to the god Krishna was actually becoming this enormous force throughout South Asia. And you can see very obviously that this kind of visual vocabulary was also very much in circulation in Portuguese Goa as well. So I think that in creating the long list, when Kevin and I were sitting down, I think a priority for the both of us was to actually look for objects that exemplified this kind of interconnectivity, this kind of dialogue, and B, also allowed us to dwell upon and kind of explore Christian belief, Christian scripture, and Christian ritual through particular objects. So, of course, the pelican monstrance was a very exciting object to look at from that perspective. Because in our very first episode, when we talk about how the monstrance was used, we introduce it by talking about these waves of incense that are spreading through the church, and then seeing this object emerging, gleaming. in the distance, which is really how these objects must have been perceived. So trying to imagine how an object could be talked about, how we can use its history to explain particular aspects of Christian history. So I think, there's a whole bunch of examples, of course, but one, for example, came from these little vials of holy water, which once again were like just so fascinating, right? Because one, of course, from looking at TV shows or movies, you always see holy water, something that, the protagonist comes into this dimly lit church and, they put their fingers into the font very dramatically and, cross themselves. But these little vials were obviously being used by priests to actually go out and give it to people because they were believed to have healing properties. And first of all, that's such an interesting application of this underlying theological principle, but also drove us, and I think Kevin did a fantastic job, I think, for every single ritual that we were talking about. He would actually go all the way back to Roman Christianity and say, oh yeah, so in the year 300 CE, or this, when this Roman emperor was persecuting this particular Christian martyr, this is what the community believed, and then in the Middle Ages, this is what they came to believe, and then when the Reformation happened, this happened. And once again, you think of the, at least to an Indian history scholar, one thinks of the Reformation as, okay, yeah, so this is happening in Europe in the 1500s, but it was also happening in Goa right here in India, also in the 15 and 1600s. It is as much as it's contemporary with Vijayanagara, it's contemporary with the Deccan Sultanates. And to me especially, of course, Kevin can speak best to his motivation, but for me especially, I think a very important factor in selecting objects was, how do I bring this contemporaneity of Indian Christianity? This idea that it's very much a part of the subcontinent's heritage, even though politically it's increasingly it's increasingly becoming taboo to even talk about this history, and hopefully we'll get to that later. How do I make sure that this is brought to life to our audience? And especially as a podcaster who has had at least some degree of success with talking about ancient India, I really wanted my audience of young Indians to talk about this. It was tremendously exciting for me when I was in Mumbai in November giving a talk. And this young man came up to me, and he had been apparently listening to my podcast since 2017. So he listened to my Ancient India podcast, he listened to my military history podcast, and he also listened to the Altar of Time. And that was so exciting because that's exactly the kind of person that I want to reach with this. So sorry, I've rambled on for long enough. So Kevin, please share your thoughts as well.
I think you've covered everything that we spoke about, right? The choices are very intentional, right? How do we maximize on all of these aspects with a particular object, right? And there are some episodes where we club two objects together just to be able to cover more of these ideas and bring about more conversations.
I just wanted to add that very early in the presentation, an attendee had a question, what is Indian Christian art? I think you all have addressed it, but maybe Natasha from the museum or Kevin might just want to, in a sentence, encapsulate what you mean by Indian Christian art.
I think we'll attempt to do it. Natasha, do you want to go first?
No, I think Kevin and Anirudh, this is the podcast that you all have made, and we'd like to listen to you.
So from where I come from, or as I see it, we have this category called Indian Islamic art, right, which recognizes the fact that Islam is a part of India and the Indian cultural milieu, and Islam has had, or rather the practitioners of Islam have had conversations with Indian culture, and art has been produced by the community as a response, right? So in the form of architecture, in the form of liturgical objects, and similarly by people outside the community responding to this phenomena of Islam in India. But we do not have this category called Indian Christian art. We don't recognize the category called Indian Christian art. And that's tragic because in every part of India, depending on the denomination, depending on the caste of the community, which is accepted or converted to Christianity, depending on the tribal affiliations, economic class, the way in which Christianity is articulated is so varied, and it's so exciting, right? And simultaneously, there have been a lot of phenomenal artists, some Christian, like Angelo Di Fonseca, F.N. D'Souza, and some non-Christian, like Anjali Ila Mellin and M.F. Hussain, who have also responded to Christianity and Christian ideas, right? Painted and a phenomenal painting, sculpture. To all of this, we need a category to refer to, right? And that is the category called Indian Christian art. Where this ends and where something else begins is context specific.
Before maybe we take other questions from the audience, one question for both of you. Which was your personal favorite object? Anirudh, maybe you can go first.
I have to say that it's probably the pelican monstrance. Because as I said, it's something that when I looked at it, I was like, oh, I've seen this on my mother's sari. That's like outlined in like kalamkari work or like in like gold thread. But Kevin was like, no, this is a pelican. So I'm like, no, this must be a peacock, So, and then really putting the episode together also, I think this encapsulated so much of like the general experience that both of us have had with the podcast, where I'm coming at it from the perspective of, okay, so how do we explain this to an audience? And Kevin is coming from more of an academic and more from a believer's point of view, because we had like so much of a back and forth where I was like, okay, so, so the wafer is Jesus, or the wafer is meant to be Jesus's body, then what is the wine? What is consecration? Why does it need to be stored in this? And just really realizing that in a lot of ways, the fact this is a receptacle for the consecrated wafer, which in a way makes it a representative of Christ himself. And then to see that this is such an Indianized object, and that it is perhaps a peacock, perhaps an eagle, perhaps even a hamsa bird, which is something you keep hearing about in Indian mythology, and also you see in so much Indian textiles. This realization that what you're looking at when you look at the pelican monstrance is not just this silver object, it's not just a pelican, it's not just a hamsa bird, but it's an Indian Jesus. Just blew my mind. It was just incredible to think about, and it was actually profoundly humbling to me that it is so commonplace in India today to make such generalizations about Indian Christianity without recognizing what an incredibly rich intellectual and artistic heritage it has, and to have that so elegantly and in such a, it's a very impressive object, but just to look at it by itself, you would never recognize that it contains so much meaning. It's just magnificent. It's an absolute masterpiece, and it's by far
really everyone's favorite and the showstopper, literally in the museum. When you come, Anirudh, you've not seen the new layout, so you should come and see it. And for everyone, of course, who has not yet visited MoCA after the upgradation, you must visit, because the pelican really takes center stage in the museum, and of course all the other stunning objects which are there. But over to you, Kevin.
I think I don't have one favorite object. I've said this before. It's very difficult for me to have a favorite object, because I feel that I have like a personal relationship. Like I've said this before, right? All this while I had a long distance relationship with these objects. I saw them in catalogs, I saw them in photographs, but I knew so much about them. It was like dating in the pandemic. And then, coming to the actual museum space and seeing them up close and personal was very, very overwhelming. But if you were to ask me from the production point of view, my favorite episode, I think, to write was the second episode, which is on the chapel itself, right? And I think there is a part of me which is there in Santa Monica, and a part of Santa Monica in me. Because Natasha, you will know this. Every now and then I come up, I'll see like, oh my God, have you read this novel? This looks like it was set in Santa Monica, right? So there is some kind of deep spiritual and emotional connection with that space. I really enjoyed writing that episode. Yeah, and maybe the episode that will release tomorrow. That was also a lot of fun. Yeah, because it talks about Goa. Yeah, and maybe you would be a better person to market it, but it talks a lot about Goa and Goan culture and how this beautiful intermingling. For the person who asks about Indian Christian art, please listen to tomorrow's episode, because it will dispel this myth that Christianity is some bomb that was dropped in from the West, right? Christianity in India is as Indian as, Vada Sambar and Parasadam and all of that, right? There's very little that makes us different from the rest of India. Please listen to tomorrow's episode.
Yes, please listen to tomorrow's episode. And I want to actually add to the last statement that you gave, Kevin, about how profoundly Indian Christianity is. I'm working on a new book about the Chola Empire, which is like, it's all the rage now, thanks to Mani Ratnam and Ponniyin Selvan. And I was, so a friend of mine whose family are Scottish Catholics was looking at a draft of the first chapter. And I just had this like throwaway line, which to me was like fairly obvious, which is that, so the Cholas come to power in about 850 CE or so. And roughly the same year, there was a Jewish gentleman called, Joseph Rabban or something, who was granted land to set up a church, to set up a synagogue in Kerala. And there's also like a bunch of like other inscriptions from the time where, like various local armed groups and chieftains grant lands to Syrian Christians who are traders and so on. And I just had this little line where I said that, yeah, so medieval Indian Christians were the contemporaries of the Cholas. And this blew his mind, because the way that we are taught about the Cholas, for example, is that they encapsulate everything that it means to be quote unquote Indian, which is that, these great conquering, devout kings who build temples and so on. And that's something that I think is a very recent political idea. This idea that Indian Christians were contemporaries of the Cholas it is completely factual, and yet it seems to be this revolutionary and shocking thing to most people, which I find so profoundly tragic, because both Christianity and Islam have been in India as long as they've existed as religions. Both of them were on India's shores within the lifetimes of their founders, which is both a testament to, I think, India's openness to the world from a very early period of time, but also to the fact that the Indian Ocean was always this place where cultures, economies intermingled at a very profound and fundamental level. And it is so tragic to me, as somebody who's interested in telling histories to India's public, that in pretending that India's history is only that of one religious group, we're actually erasing such a fundamental aspect of what it has meant to be Indian for the longest time. When I mentioned a little earlier that I wrote a column for the print about India's Christian art, and it received weeks of the most vitriolic trolling from the right wing, because people were insisting that the history of Indian Christianity, especially in Goa, was one of complete barbarism because of the Portuguese Inquisition. And it is just so tragic to me that that is what they hung up on in the entire article. They ignored everything else I was saying about the Indian artists who are making these objects. And it's not like I was set out. I did address the fact that the Inquisition happened, but they were like, you didn't say enough about the Inquisition. Like, they had reduced the entirety of India's Christianity to a few decades of persecution by a state. And a very famous right-wing influencer wrote a quote-unquote rebuttal to the article, and I was given the opportunity to write a rebuttal to her rebuttal. And I wrote, because she was pointing out that, oh, yeah, so here are all these, like, sources that are written by, the Portuguese state saying that, we want to do this and that, we want to do this and that. And I said, okay, but then here are the actual proceedings of this diocesan council, which says we want to do such and such things because most of the houses of the faithful have objects that are being made by quote unquote heathens. And it seems superficially that this is an example of religious intolerance. But once you actually read between the lines, the most important line is most of the houses of the faithful have objects that are made by heathens. Hindus were making objects for most Indo-Portuguese Christian households. And many of these objects, no doubt, are actually in the museum's collection today. And I think the most important line that popped into my head when I was writing that rebuttal is that the activities of a few individuals, and there have been individuals like this in every single religious community in India, none of us are saints, do not define the history of an entire community. And it's so tragic that in our political environment today, that this has become so commonplace that the actions of a few individuals from a few hundred years ago are held to define and to erase the histories of entire communities that in general have been enormously creative and as Indian as any other community.
Maybe we can take some more questions.
Sure. I think you just addressed some of the questions that people were, or some of the attendees were asking about retelling history and I guess, the makership of the objects. While Kevin, I know you mentioned earlier that we don't really know who the makers of some of these objects are, but in your presentation and often in your podcast, you hint at the possible makers of these objects. So if you could share a little bit with the audience what your findings were.
Sure. So with some objects, it's a lot more direct. For instance, when we talk about the Pascal candle stand, which is a beautiful large candle stand made entirely of wood. At first, I didn't think there was a lot that could be done there, but then on a little digging, I discovered that Goa has a very long tradition of woodwork, which is kind of dying out. It's not necessarily being preserved the way it should be. And I was very excited to discover that some of these artisans, so it's a caste group. The caste is called the Chari community. And some of these artisans are so excellent that they have the patronage of the state, as in the Indian state, the state of India, and were sent to, Lisbon for training and, to give workshops and things like that. So with some objects, it's easy to make these direct connections, right? With some objects, we have to do a little educated guesswork. So for instance, with the ivories, right? We know of ivories coming from other parts of the Indian Ocean world, and there is some amount of work done on the ivories in Goa. So we were able to draw the fact that, okay, some of these may have come from Africa, some of them may have come from Sri Lanka, but there is very little work on the existence of workshops, right, at that particular time and space, right? So what those workshops look like, who were employed in these workshops. At least at this point, we don't have the resources. There are probably records and archives somewhere in the world, because, all colonizers were meticulous, what shall I say, documenters of the things that we did. So they probably records in archives somewhere, but to connect these, to access all of these archives and access all of this information and then connect them to these specific objects is a lifetime of work. So like you said, as often as possible, we try to draw parallels between existing traditions which are studied and establish these kind of things.
And Sita Reddy has asked a related question. So how often, when you're talking about these objects, have you relied on the museum's accession records, and how much of it is going out and seeking historical information on the object?
So the museum's catalog is very evocatively written, right? It has very beautiful descriptions of the objects, and very often that is our primary text, right? The catalog with the the description of the object. Then what we do is, we just start searching for how this object is used in liturgy. I mean, of course, sometimes it's very obvious. There are some objects, for example, altar cards, they're no longer used in churches, but there are altar cards in the collection of the museum. So sometimes we have to search for what these objects mean in the context of Christianity and Christian worship. And then we have to search. Sometimes we're very lucky. Like, for example, in the context of the Indo-Portuguese ivories, we found some work already done. So we're able to make established connections and, build on that information. And when we're at loss and there's absolutely nothing that we can do, right, with regards to this information, we just turn to storytelling. So for instance, in the episode of Nirmala Mata, while there is a lot written on Indo-Portuguese art, we also dedicate some part of that episode to talk about Indian nationalism and what Raja Ravi Varma means to Indian nationalism, right? Similarly, in the episode on the Paschal candle, we dedicate some amount of space to just describe the Easter liturgy. Why is light such an important part of Easter worship, and why is this object so important, right? So when we have failed to get accurate information on the source of the object and who made it, we then turn to what is the object used for, right? And if this object could speak, what would it probably say? What are the things it would have seen or heard? And I think that's what makes us really fortunate, right? I'm grateful that we're not writing a book per se, or let's say an academic article, because we're given the space to be creative. This is as much as an academic exercise as it is a creative exercise.
I think there is a suggestion for a book.
Yes, there is. There is a suggestion for a book. And that's interesting that you say that, because, there's a lot of, some of the questions in the Q&A is about feedback to the religious symbols, and how something then how you're calling something art, and how this retelling of history happens today. So there are those questions as well. But I guess, like you're saying, there's also this creative way of, I guess what both you and Anirudh are trying to do is engage people with these objects, right? There's an audience out there that's listening to this piece, and you're trying to bring them and engage them with the museum that's in Goa. Coming back, I mean, Natasha, I think because this project was implemented during the pandemic, I know that there were a lot of challenges. Kevin, Anirudh, if there's something specific you would like to share with audiences about some of your challenges.
Should I go first?
Sure, please.
I think, not being used to working long distance initially was a challenge, communication, but we adapted really well because we were able to send Anirudh and Kevin the catalog. So they had the primary written texts with them about each object. And from there, the back and forth, we would just set up a time during the week and discuss the scripts when they were writing, or any questions that they had. I think the challenges were also sometimes resources besides the catalog to get more information with regards to some specific objects. I think there were challenges in those spaces, but like Kevin pointed out and Anirudh pointed out, going back to some historical facts to how the object may have been used during the Mass, and some storytelling, like in the case of the Nirmala Mata, also getting a little bit of perspective on how the object was found by Father Joaquim Loyola Pereira in his seminary room. So I think that added on to the whole interest in the podcast. And for me, my personal favorite, of course, was the Paschal candle stand, because I was listening. It was launched just before Easter, and it really made Easter so much special, because just before you go for the Easter vigil, you're listening to this beautiful episode on the Paschal candle stand. It just was magical. So my personal favorite. And I know we're talking about challenges, but deviating, I think the challenges were easily overcome, because they've done a wonderful job with each and every episode of this podcast. You are yet to listen to it. I've read through all the scripts, so I know that they've done a great job, and really looking forward to all of them, being released shortly.
And Kevin, maybe you could share some of the innovative things that you've done to overcome some of these challenges as well.
Yes, I will. Let me just share screen and get the slide on. So one of my favorite stories in the making of this podcast involves the Turubal. And one of the things that I was very insistent on is that at some point in the soundscape, of course, when we began this project, we began very ambitiously. We thought we would go to Goa and we would record sounds in situ in the churches of Goa, but then, we didn't have the time and budget for it. So then we just moved on to the next idea, which is to, record soundscape, pick up sounds from the internet and work. And one of the things that sets Catholicism apart from Protestantism is the use of incense, right? And while we don't have an episode on the Turubal itself, the sound of the Turubal is very characteristic of Catholic worship, right? And it's a very beautiful, soft sound of the Turubal itself chinking against the chain, right? And this is done at the high points of the liturgy, and it's very difficult at those moments for someone to record, right? To actually go onto the altar and record. It's a very, very soft sound. The next thing we did was we looked at online church services where we saw the Turubal being used, but we couldn't hear the sound, right? Because it's such a soft, delicate sound. And I was adamant. I drove Anirudh and Ishan up the wall. I said, we have to have this at some point as part of the soundscape. And Ishan, who is, God bless him for his industriousness and innovation, he discovered a scene from Eyes Wide Shut by Stanley Kubrick. And he saw what the Turubal looks like and how it works. And then he decided to recreate the sound, right? So he took his dog chain and a vessel, and he just rattled them together till he got the sound right, exactly the sound that the Turubal makes. So when you actually listen to the episodes of the podcast, wherever there is a mention of incense and you hear the sound of the Turubal, the chinking of the chains in threes, because that's how it's done in church, That's actually not a turubal, but it is a brass utensil and a dog's chain being linked together, right? It makes us ask some very profound questions about the idea of, authenticity. What should a church sound like? Because one would imagine a church is a place of silence. But when you listen to our opening track, you hear all of the sounds that make it an alive space, right? The sounds of people whispering, the sounds of pages rustling, the sounds of fans, and it's fascinating to imagine what is this process that we undergo, right? So we have to first think of what people will think the church and the objects will sound like, and then we work backwards. Sometimes we get real sounds from, for instance, in situ, like the sound of the pipe organ. Sometimes we have to manufacture sounds, like we've done with the turubal, and then sometimes we're lucky enough to find, sound indices on the internet which we can use. So this was one of my favorite challenges that we encountered.
I mean, there are a lot of appreciative messages coming in for the podcast, for your work. People who visited the museum and say that the podcast has really brought this life. You might want to stop screen share, Kevin. Very appreciative of the work that you've been doing. So do read the comments about how you've enriched the engagement with the museum. One of the questions that came in, was like, how can practitioners engage with this kind of work? And perhaps maybe you can also tie it into, the kind of the feedback, how the feedback that you're getting into this project and the responses that you're getting to this podcast.
If I can share screen again,
Sure.
Go back there. So one of the most exciting things that has happened is, the ability to take this podcast out, apart from the podcast itself, but, to be able to go to public spaces, to colleges and talk about it. And I'll just share one of the things that we discovered. So, and these are fascinating avenues, right, that will only emerge the more people engage with the objects in the museum and, think about these things as connected histories. So I want to show you this object. This is a monstrance, which is used for the adoration of the Eucharist. And in a church, you would probably see it about 15 or 20 feet away from you, even if you sit in the first bench, right, because it's placed on the altar. And I want to draw your attention to this little motif over here, right, which is a flower. And it would absolutely be invisible if you were to see it in a church because of the distance at which it's placed. But very interestingly, this is a very common jewelry motif, right? The idea, I mean, in our Konkani communities, we have the idea of the kurka, a floral kind of earring which women wear. And every time I talk about the museum and the museum's collection, I talk about this particular motif and how there's a very good chance that a jeweler who made women's jewelry actually made this monstrance, right? Not some expert metalsmith, but a jeweler who works with women's jewelry. And a couple of months ago, I met Hita Pandit. Hita Pandit is a friend of MoCA and is a very well-established name when it comes to talking about anything related to Goa. And Hita Pandit, after listening to this presentation, she pointed out how her own mother's wedding jewelry, which was made in the 1950s, uh, has exactly the same motif. Right? And Hita comes from the Parsi community. So she says that it was made by a Parsi jeweler. And while we were talking and getting very excited about this, our immediate thought was, where was this monstrance made? Was there a Parsi goldsmith colony, perhaps in Goa? Or, did this happen in Gujarat, which is also the center of the Parsi community? And suddenly there were so many more questions we had about this object, more questions than we could imagine answering, right? So every time, I saw a question in the chat about, how do we take this forward? And I think the only way you take it forward is, you keep engaging with these objects. And I think you keep talking about these objects to people. And the more you talk about these objects, the more you discover, because every single time someone sees some of these objects through the presentation, we come up with new stories, with new experiences. I think I shared earlier about how, when I spoke about the pelican monstrance, for instance, there was a student who brought in this idea of how in the Syrio-Malabar Church in Kerala, there is this idea that the flesh of the peacock is incorruptible. Which is why in many Syrian Christian art objects, the peacock is used to represent Christ, right? And then later on, we traced it to a verse in the writing of Saint Augustine, where he makes a reference to this idea that the flesh of the peacock is incorruptible. Right? And in our earlier pre-presentation conversation, Natasha mentioned that there is another use of the peacock motif in another church in Goa. Right? It's only when we keep talking about these objects and talking to people who read about these or are part of communities that engage with art or with history that we discover more. And I really believe the possibilities are infinite.
Thank you, Kevin. Again, we'll request you to stop. Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of people who, like, the person who asked about how to take this kind of work forward. I mean, if you're looking to work with museums or collections, of course, you can consider IFA's Archives and Museum program. But if you're interested in the creation of podcasts, Anirudh and Kevin are the folks to talk to and maybe connect with them, online to take this forward. Also, Fraser Andrade from Facebook, comments on his interest in Goan art and that he would like to conserve, document. He has a personal collection and he would like to conserve that. So again, Fraser, do connect with either MoCA or Kevin and Anirudh online on Facebook or Instagram to see what possibilities might exist. Natasha, I mean, I know we've had a very rich discussion and there's so much more to share because we know the kind of, the episodes that are coming through, but is there any other closing questions or for Kevin and Anirudh?
Actually, no questions for them, but just looking forward to seeing a wider audience or listeners accessing this podcast. And of course, Anirudh, with his popularity with podcasts, already has a fan following there. So, but also the Museum of Christian Art, like we have it right at our entrance when you enter, Altar of Time is mentioned, and people are really surprised, pleasantly surprised that, oh, there is a podcast on the museum objects. So it really excites them. I had somebody from the Nuncio's office, that is the Vatican representative in India, from one of the priests who came here a couple of weeks back. And he was like, oh, I must have the link of this. And I sent him, and he was really grateful because they never expected a podcast on museum objects and on the Museum of Christian Art. So thank you, IFA, and thank you, Kevin and Anirudh, for giving us the first of its kind podcast on a museum collection, for India. So that's really something that MoCA is really proud about, along with IFA and you. And hope we'll have many more listeners, of course, after today's session, and visitors, of course, who are coming in. We had G20 delegates yesterday, again, who looked at it and said, okay, we click on the link and we'll start listening right away. So that was really heartening to experience with the delegates also. Yes, to all our listeners and viewers for today's session, tomorrow is going to be the launch of another episode, tomorrow being the Feast of St. John the Baptist. So please listen in to the session tomorrow, the podcast for tomorrow.
Kevin, Anirudh, we've talked quite extensively about how you put, but I know there were lots of challenges as well in representation, in the retelling, and engaging with these objects, but they've been quite well received as well. Kevin, Anirudh, would you like to share a little bit more about what is audiences can expect in tomorrow's episode that's dropping?
So like Natasha said, tomorrow is the feast of St. John the Baptist, and St. John the Baptist is, what should I say? I mean, it's a very important feast in the calendar of feasts in Goa, but it's not the kind of feast that you imagine it to be, right? If you imagine, people sweating in church and, wiping their faces with their kerchiefs and all of that, that's not what this feast is about. It's also clubbed together with the feast of Saint Anne, or Santana, as she's called in Goa. And especially the bit about Santana is very, very fascinating because, again, you will see how this whole idea of this borrowing between Christianity and Hinduism and how it merges together so seamlessly in the honoring and of Saint Anne. So that's what you probably look at. This episode is special because it's not just about the saints who make up the calendar of the church, but it's also about the spirit of Goa, right? And the Goan people, and what being Christian means to being Goan, and what being Goan means to being Christian. So that's why it's a very special episode. It's not just about the saints, but it's also about the people of Goa and everything that makes Goa, Goa.
And Anirudh, any thoughts you'd like to share before we close? We've gone over time, so.
Well, there's really not a lot I can add to talking about the episode itself, but I do have an observation on, I think, another one of the museum's celebrity objects, which is Nirmala Mata. I used to work for the Museum of Art and Photography. Actually, I was working for them full time while also making MoCA's podcast, which was complete chaos as far as my work life is concerned, but very exciting because I was actually editing an article on Raja Ravi Varma, which entailed like quite a lot of reading and like understanding of like the enormity of the role that this gentleman's art played in the emergence of this idea of what Hinduism in India should look like. So in the early 20th century, this idea that the archetypal Indian goddess looks like a modestly dressed upper caste Hindu woman really takes root because of the popularity of Ravi Varma's prints, which becomes so popular that he actually arguably invents piracy in India because everybody in South Asia wants to copy Raja Ravi Varma's prints and make profits from them. And to me, Nirmala Mata was so fascinating because even though the 20th century saw this coalescence of what we think of as identity for Hindu India, it's also the same process actually happening in India's Christian art as well, where the idea of what the Virgin Mary looks like is also being influenced by broader trends in South Asian art at large. And I think, I don't really have a single lesson from this, but I hope that like just as this whole like random unorganized chain of thoughts gives you an idea of the complexity of what we're talking about. To me, it's talking and like researching and trying to tell audiences about objects like this is profoundly humbling because it shows me how little I actually know about the world. And I think to an extent, it's something that all of us who are interested in India's history would do very well to keep in mind, which is you can spend lifetimes upon lifetimes trying to understand India's artistic heritage and still not even scratch the surface. And yeah, that's about, I hope that expresses something.
Sure. No, thanks, Anirudh. I think, a lot of, after encountering this project, being to the Museum of Christian Art, listening to Kevin and you, to the various presentations you've made over time, when I step into a church, I think I reflect on the rituals differently. I see things differently. And I think that's the beauty of this podcast as well. It's enabling someone who may be embedded already in the practice to actually see their own faith or the representation of their faith in new ways and see things that we may have missed before because we've not paid attention to it, right? And that's really wonderful. And I think that's what I would invite audiences to do. A, of course, to listen to the podcast. But B, also, I think what this podcast will enable you to do is when you do visit the Museum of Christian Art, to, not all objects are represented in the podcast. There are about 18, and then there's going to be 25 or so. And just to be able to then engage with the collection, having had this background that both Kevin and Anirudh have presented with us, I think that is in itself would be interesting. So for starters, of course, for those of us who aren't going to Goa immediately, listen to the podcast, but do visit the Museum of Christian Art as well and engage with that piece. One of the things that came as a question very late, but I'll just leave it with Natasha, is someone saying whether there'll be audio guides to each object, but I guess there's a way to link each of the things that they're talking about and have the podcast at those objects wherever they're displayed in the museum. If you have that.
So we don't already have that linked also because we are in this very old historic building. We
Sure,
have
sure.
network issues within,
Sure,
and
sure.
podcast is reachable and accessible through the internet. And we have Wi-Fi related issues within. Of course, we're trying to overcome those. For now, we have an intranet-based audio guide that we had worked on during the pandemic. And of course, Anirudh and Kevin's podcast, The Order of Time, is accessible to the audiences. They scan the code and they listen to it even as soon as they step out of the museum, right in the courtyard, and they can take it with them, unlike the audio guide that we have within the museum. So this is something that's accessible anywhere, anytime, any place. So though we will try and link it up, but I think that's the next step for us. At this moment, you can still listen to it anytime, any place.
And that, I guess, that was the beginning point for Anirudh and Kevin, to take the museum out, take the objects out of the museum and accessible across the world. So on that note, we'll end this presentation. Thank you so much, Natasha, Kevin, and Anirudh, for this very rich collaboration that we've had, both with MoCA and both of you as coordinators. We'd also like to thank the Goethe Institute Delhi and Parijat Foundation, who supported this project. For those of you, do stay tuned on our social media, get on our mailing list. The details are in the comment box for our next project showcase that will happen next month. But before that, we have an event from the IFA archive. It's called Date with the Archive, where we invite artists to talk about ways in which they engage with the archive in their own practice. So taking this conversation from museums to archives, we'll have Shubha Mudgal talk about her practice and the role of archive in Hindustani classical music as a practitioner, as a teacher, and as an artist, and how she gets creative inspiration from archives. So do join us on June 28th at 6:30 p.m. on Zoom or on our Facebook page. Also, for those interested, we have requests for proposals under our arts practice program as well as our arts education program. So please do check them out and apply to us. Thank you all. Thank you all for being such a lovely audience, very engaged audience with your questions and your comments. And thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you all. See you. Good night.
See you.
Thank you.